Creation, Book of Portals, Chapter 6. She had been on Narleo for almost 11 human months. K1 had been right. Narleo was a paradise. The planet was mostly hollow. It reminded her of an emptied Lindt chocolate. Instead of Narleo's population existing on the exterior surface of the planet, like Earth, they lived on the inside. The interior of the planet was split almost in half. She had learned from the history book that Narleo had formed from the aftermath of a planetary implosion. Narleo was once a planet that supported life on its outer surface. So, on their external planetary excavations, Narlops had found traces of life through plant matter and animal fossils. It seemed to be an oasis of sorts after the DNA of the recovered specimens were studied. But upon further research, they also found evidence of an interplanetary rupture. The planet's current hollowed-out structure was the result of a blast that originated from the core of the planet. The blast was estimated to be as strong as 10 suns imploding in on themselves at once. No life survived, but the planet that was once mostly solid was now mostly emptied out. And the suns that were once in existence in its atmosphere died. The Narlops, escaping from their own dying planet, once called Narlan, sought refuge here, naming their new planet Narleo and creating their own version of a paradise from the wreckage. On one side of the planet was the peaceful haven where Narlops set up their advanced civilization. Vehicles, buildings, experimental facilities, recreational areas, mountainous regions, hydroponic systems, and even schools. On the other side were earthy tunnels the Narlops used as sleeping quarters. Even though they were rather dark, the Narlops found ways to make them look modern and even comfortable. Their residences reminded her of cave homes, ones that were popular on reality TV shows back home. The Narlops needed damp and dark environments to sleep peacefully, the book said. As they slept, the tunnels activated their healing cycles, repairing most of the damage experienced by day-to-day wear on their physical forms. In the center of the planet was a sun-like orb that they called the Great Luminary. It provided light and heat to the entire planet. From the book, she learned the Narlops found a way to bring light to the once dark and deserted planet, but it had no mention of how they managed to do it. Over time, the water reservoirs that existed on the outside surface of the planet carved into the remaining stone to form one large body of water that lied beneath the luminary, branching out into rivers and streams all over. She loved looking at the water. It was livelier and it sparkled so much brighter than the ocean on Earth. When she first arrived, whenever they needed to navigate the tunnels, the Narlops would use a large machine designed to pull an orb of light from the luminary. Then, they'd hold the orb tenderly, carefully, and use it as their guide to illuminate their way. She'd noticed that many of the Narlops had scars from holding the orbs too close, scarring that wouldn't disappear during their healing cycles. Sometimes, when too many orbs were pulled from the luminary, it would look small and dull. But the next day, without fail, a Narlop would bring in dozens of new orbs, and suddenly, the luminary would be gleaming again. Somehow, the empty feeling in her chest never went away. But that wasn't what intrigued her the most. Everything on Narleo revolved around portals. Aside from her and the other humans, almost everyone was able to open their own. Even though not all Narlips had wristbands, portals were available to every creature. Well, to an extent. Intergalactic travel was only available to those with the wristbands. Interplanetary travel, however, was approved for those with authorized body scans. On every entrance to a portal on the planet, there was a mechanism that checked each creature for clearance. Narlips who fell out of favor with the rest of society, usually through indecent behavior, were subjected to revoked portal privileges. She didn't know what happened to misbehaving humans, however, though part of her truly never wanted to discover the consequence of it. Along the edges of the planet were what the Narlips called extraction stations. These were large, circular-shaped machinery designed to amplify the technology of the wristbands. On their own, the Portalee's wristband would open a shimmering, circular portal large enough for only a few Narlips to use. But the extraction stations widened the portals enough for the Narlip ships to pass through. The ships were mainly sphere-shaped, but she often thought about how the one that captured her had the capability to unravel into a snake-like form. She wondered if they were all like that. She shivered at the thought. The most shocking part of it all was that she wasn't the only human there. In fact, there were others. A small community of 8 humans encased in their own flesh suits. Some wore actual clothing, jewelry, and even wigs from Earth on top of their anuras, items gathered by the Narlips on their space expeditions. She was offered wigs and jewelry as well, but she chose not to wear them. Instead, she opted for a simple black jumpsuit with black sneakers. She didn't need much. She didn't want much. On her first day, it was strange, seeing the humans, especially since her last interaction with another fellow human ended in betrayal. She almost didn't know how to behave when she first came across them. She could tell they weren't used to newcomers, and they could tell that she was hesitant. Then, she saw the child. It was a young girl who looked no more than 8 years old, wearing a soft pink dress over her skin suit. She had a dark, curly wig and large brown eyes. The girl had let go of her guardian's hand and approached her, smiling. Suddenly, there was a name in her head.
Amelia.
The little girl was named Amelia. She was confused, before remembering the skin suits they wore helped them to communicate. She replied to the girl, "Nice to meet you." The little girl stared at her for a moment before returning back to her guardian, an older man, maybe her grandfather. When this happened, it was as if the small group of humans softened a bit. She was officially accepted. Soon, she learned their names, their backgrounds, and how they came to exist in Arleo. Every single one had been taken either while they were in bed, trekking through a forest, or wandering the streets at night. One of them had even prayed to be abducted, and soon those prayers were answered. When she shared her own story, though, the group fell quiet. They exchanged looks of sympathy with her, and in that moment, she realized the other humans also knew what she was experiencing. She suddenly didn't feel so alone. It was weird, of course, being human in an environment not entirely conducive to humanity. But she was alive despite the effort of her former colleagues. And despite her initial frustrations and hang-ups, the Narlips were actually kind. They gave her a home, one that was in the same neighborhood that housed the other humans. She learned a little later that one of the other humans, the one that wanted to be abducted, came up with the idea for the neighborhood. But part of her wondered if grouping the humans all together was done as a compassionate gesture or as a means of easier surveillance. But she decided not to dwell on it. Throughout her days, many Narlops greeted her. Admittedly, most were blatantly indifferent, but none sought to treat her badly. They mostly kept to themselves, but she couldn't blame them. The humans mostly did the same too. Even if there were a problem, it was their planet after all. Who was she to take offense to how they behaved? She'd often think about how in the movies, alien creatures were torturous or even evil, but somehow, despite their looks, their manners were even better than that of humans. Many of the Narlops kept their lizard-like shape, but every so often she'd see alien forms walking around, though it unnerved her that so many took on the form of the creature from the movie Alien. She was expecting far more ETs or even the typical bulbous, tear-shaped head of the gray alien she grew up seeing in the media. She'd find herself wondering what her uncle would think if he were there to see them, or even to witness her interacting with him. Of course, she was still homesick. She never let go of the desire to see her family again. But as time wore on, she started to feel as if she could make a life there, one closer to the kind she had actually wanted to live. Over the months, she found a way to connect with the other humans. She hadn't physically eaten anything in over a year, so she'd occasionally ask K1, who was in charge of human interactions, to display cooking shows for the group. She also asked to borrow cookbooks from the Hollow Library located on the planet. On her first visit, she was overwhelmed at the sheer vastness of the facility. It was made almost entirely of carbon and chrome. Approaching the entrance, her full body was scanned and a circular portal opened up in the wall of the facility to allow her through. Stepping into a portal felt like her body was moving through a thin film of plastic. There was always a slight resistance before she passed through to the other side. The inside of the library was grand, with 9 levels that rose up above her. The walls of the facility was mostly see-through. The image that was shown to her on the ship made the library itself look holographic, but it wasn't. It was actually made of a clear, solid structural material. It reminded her of an iridescent plexiglass, but sturdier. The interior was crowded with chrome shelves of holographic books that were stacked as far as the eye could see. To get to a different level, she'd approach the nearest Narlop and ask them to open a portal to the corresponding floor. The level that held information about food across galaxies was located on floor 4. So she'd portal to the floor and search through the impossibly vast collection of information until she found a familiar-sounding cookbook. She used to try cuisines from other worlds, but after she found a recipe that used rotted animal carcass as an ingredient, she tended to steer far away from foreign world foods. The first human cookbook she ever grabbed was one called Country Living and Hospitality. She remembered hearing rave reviews about it when she was still on Earth. With the cookbook, she'd find a recipe, gather the humans in the recreational center, another chrome and carbon constructed building, and she'd ask K1 to project a video of a chef making the recipe. Then, as they watched the dish being prepared and finished, K1 would display the image onto the table in front of them. The smell and taste would be projected into their minds as if they were experiencing it live. They'd sit at the table, simulating feasting, talking about their day, enjoying the camaraderie, avoiding the ever-present need to go home. Eventually, some of the Narlops joined her. Though they didn't need to eat often, Their main sustenance came from the atmosphere of the planet and seeped into their scales. They grew fond of pretending to eat with the humans. Before long, large groups of Narlips would join them, day after day, telling stories of their adventures, pretending the food in front of them was delicious and perfectly cooked. The smothered southern fried steak seemed to be a crowd favorite. One Narlip that was particularly fond of the dinners was one she learned was named Hio. Hio was shorter than many of the others, taking on an average human height of about 5'11", rather than choosing to tower above them. While most other Narlips chose to stay in their natural lizard-like or even creepier alien-like form, Hio decided to take on a shape that was similar to a human's. It had a human-like torso and limbs, but the fingers were too long and skinny. There were also 8 on each hand. The head was diamond-shaped with the forehead protruding outward. The mouth was small, with tiny sharpened teeth behind its lips, but there were eyes on either side of it. In fact, there were eyes all over the face. So, in actuality, Hio looked nothing like a human. But in comparison to the other creatures, it was relatively close. Hio was a Narlip that was recently promoted to lead expeditions. Every so often, which equated to about twice a human month, Hio would gather a group of Narlip subordinates in a ship and lead through one of the extraction station points. When Hio returned, it would have very vivid and extravagant stories to tell about its trips during their dinners. Like her uncle, Hio was very gifted at storytelling. Hio once told a story about how it and its crew prevented a flesh-eating toxin from destroying a planet. The surviving populace was so grateful, Hio said, that they pledged their allegiance to the Narlip civilization. She didn't quite know how to feel about these stories, so she would just listen intently and nod, like she did when her uncle would share his own. In addition to acquiring cookbooks, sometimes she'd find art supplies like canvases and paints, and teach art classes. Her own sketchbook had been filled to the brim of various drawings of buildings, creatures, humans, the wristbands, and the Great Luminary. There were tons of sketches of the Great Luminary. Admittedly, she had formed a tiny obsession with it when she first arrived. It was one of the many mysteries of the planet that she couldn't quite figure out. She knew the giant light orb powered virtually everything on the planet, but that was about it. She often found herself frustrated with the thought that she couldn't figure it all out, though. And when she asked about it, she was met with blank stares. Once, she tried searching the library to find another history book on Narleo, but she was blocked from doing so. The attending Narlip told her that the floor was off limits to her. So eventually, she gave up and allowed her fixation on the orb to exist in her sketchbook only. One time, she was outside the recreational center, sketching the luminary as she waited for the others to arrive for their dinner. Hio came early this day and noticed her drawing. Hio watched in silence, its dozens of eyes studying the strokes her hollow pencils made on the paper in her sketchbook. The Narlip sat for a while, observing, saying nothing. Then, as more Narlips and humans started to approach, Hio pointed one of its 16 fingers at her, then the sketch. It moved its finger to point at the floating luminary, the wristband on its arm, and then back to her. She looked into the set of eyes located in the center of Hio's head, the only one she could focus on. Strangely, it seemed almost sympathetic in the way that it gazed back at her. She didn't understand what it meant, but she also felt it was not the right time to ask. About 4 human months in since landing, she'd stopped watching the earthly news reports about her disappearance. After a long investigation, they determined her disappearance was due to a suicide. There was apparently no evidence of foul play. For a while, she'd watch each of her family members cry their eyes out on international TV. They aired her tragic story too many times to count, even bringing up past relationship partners that called her the life of the party. Even she wouldn't have considered herself that, but as with the theme of all true crime type documentaries, it had to be said about the victim. It was particularly painful watching her mom blame the family's unrelenting focus on her succeeding as an astronaut as a reason behind her daughter's apparent suicide. She wasn't technically wrong, though. One time, they brought her uncle on to interview him, and instead of offering the usual tears and frustrations, he just stared into the camera in silence. He looked different. Healthier, somehow. His eyes weren't blank and sunken in like the way she had been used to seeing when she was on Earth. His eyes had life in them, and sometimes it felt like he could see her. After a while, they eventually stopped covering the story. Even an event as sensational as an astronaut being lost to the mystery of space started to lose its appeal after a while. It was too sad. There was no hope, no news about her whereabouts, no rescue mission. To them, she was gone. She couldn't blame them, really. She was vanished from herself as well. With the time freed from routinely watching for updates, she decided to learn and discover as much as possible about her new home. It wasn't that the desire for her to return to her family didn't permeate through her entire being, but she knew how to read people. And even though the Narlips weren't exactly people, she knew when they didn't want to address something. It seemed like the more she asked about returning home, the more she was shunned by them. The book she had been given offered little to no hope, but she studied it anyway. She found herself poring over the passages night after night before collapsing into her bed. After the 7th month, she noticed something strange about the other humans. She realized her connection to them started to dwindle. Though at points her and the others would collectively share in the sadness of being separated from Earth, after studying the humans and their behaviors, they all seemed so empty, lifeless even. The only thing that seemed to bring them semblances of true joy were the dinners and the art lessons she would organize. But other than that, their time was mainly spent reporting to the Narlips for experimentations, daily telecasts broadcasts across the universe, the occasional recreational activity, and engaging in the same conversations over and over. She had heard their stories about their abductions too many times to count, but somehow, when they'd recount the stories, they'd all react as if it was their first time telling it. Even though she personally had told her story 5 separate times, they still cried like they did the first time. Every month, the group of humans would disappear for what they would call testing. She herself hadn't been asked to go yet, as the Narlip said she hadn't been on the planet long enough. The humans never seemed to be apprehensive about leaving, though, not even Amelia. But when they returned, they seemed a bit more dazed, slightly more disconnected than before. It was then, when she started to see the look of disconnection growing behind their pupils, that she realized they were stuck. All of them had lost their will to leave. She didn't really blame them, though. For some of them, Earth had left them behind long ago, decades ago, they didn't really have a life to return to. So she made the hard decision that if she were ever to leave, to escape, she wouldn't include anyone else. She had seen many prison escape movies, and they all ended terribly after the main character involved the wrong person. She knew she had to be immensely careful. She was comfortable with being selfish. Unlike in the movies, she also knew her mind was being consistently monitored. Her training conditioned her into creating steps and following procedures. She was taught to focus on just the task at hand in order to minimize mistakes. So she applied this tactic to her own thoughts and behaviors, regulating and curating her thought patterns. She trained herself to develop a thought pattern of willful resistance that ultimately gave way to acceptance of fate. She had been careful. It had been a chore, but she knew that if she were to be freed, she had to take the necessary steps, the necessary precautions. She would not mess this up for herself. So when she organized the dinners and taught the art classes, she made sure to only focus on what was in front of her. She focused only on what would make her desirable and useful. She knew she had to wait for the right moment. K1 had told her when she first arrived that she'd learn to open her own portals in due time. But she was smart. She knew what would be expected of her in order to receive the information she needed. So gradually, she stopped asking about Earth and pivoted. Instead, with her newfound popularity, she also volunteered herself and her knowledge. After her conversation on board the ship, she realized it was rare that they encountered a human that had an extensive and intimate knowledge of both human culture and its scientific advantages. Usually, as with the other humans on the planet, they were kept to be studied. But her unique scientific training made her useful. For the second time in her entire life, she found herself thanking her family. So over time, when the Narlops were discussing new technology brought in from their travels through various parts of the universe, she added her expertise. And when one day, months later, they brought in a damaged Portales wristband, she was excited to help. Hello, this is Michaela Simone Mack, author and writer of Creation, Book of Portals. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second season. I'm very excited to share this story with you. As always, every episode is coming out on Friday, so please stay tuned for next week. I would be greatly appreciative if you continue to listen, and also if you left comments about what you think about the story, and also if you shared it with your friends. Thank you so much. Have a great day. I'll speak to you again next Friday. Bye-bye.